She traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, carrying a secret that could get her killed. When Sarah arrived at Blackwood Ridge, she expected a hard life, but she didn't expect him. Silas Coulter, a man as jagged and cold as the mountains themselves. But on their third night, the pain became too much to hide. When she finally whispered, "I've been aching down there," she thought he would cast her out into the snow. Instead, what the lonely mountain man did next changed everything. This isn't just a romance. It's a story of survival, dark secrets, and a twist you won't see coming. The stagecoach rattled so violently that Sarah Ann Miller felt her teeth might shatter. The Colorado Territory in 1874 was not a place for the weak, and it certainly wasn't a place for a woman wearing a silk dress hidden beneath 3 layers of rough wool. Outside, the wind howled like a dying wolf. Inside the coach, the air was stale, smelling of old tobacco and unwashed bodies. But Sarah didn't mind the smell. She minded the fear. It sat in her throat, a cold, hard lump that hadn't dissolved since she boarded the train in Boston 2 weeks ago. She clutched her carpetbag tight. Inside was everything she owned: a silver hairbrush, a Bible, and a letter of correspondence from a man named Silas Coulter. Silas Coulter. The name sounded like granite. His letters had been brief, practical, and utterly devoid of romance. "I have a cabin. I have 300 acres. I need a wife who can cook and keep the fire. I do not drink. I do not hit. If you come, come alone." It was the come alone part that had terrified her the most, yet it was also her salvation. Sarah was running, not from the law, at least not yet, but from a reputation that had been set on fire by a man she foolishly trusted. Boston whispered that Sarah Miller was a thief. They whispered she had seduced the son of a banker and made off with the family jewels. None of it was true. But in a society built on appearances, the truth mattered less than the gossip. So she became a mail-order bride. "Blackwood Ridge!" the driver hollered, the coach jerking to a halt. Sarah stumbled out into the biting cold. The world was white. Snow piled high against the trunks of towering pines. The station was nothing more than a shack with a leaning porch. And standing on that porch was a mountain of a man. Silas Coulter was bigger than she imagined. He wore a coat made of bear fur, and his hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes. A thick, dark beard covered half his face, but it didn't hide the scar running from his ear to his jawline. He didn't smile. He stepped off the porch, the snow crunching loudly under his heavy boots. He looked at the driver, then at Sarah. "You Sarah?" His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "I am," she said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Mr. Coulter?" He didn't answer. He simply reached out, took her heavy trunk with one hand as if it weighed nothing, and nodded toward a wagon hitched to 2 massive black horses. "Rod's closing. We need to move. No hello. No, how was your journey?" Just the brutal practicality of survival. The ride to his cabin was silent. Sarah sat on the hard wooden bench, the cold seeping through her layers. Every bump in the road sent a sharp, blinding jolt of pain shooting through her right hip and thigh. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, refusing to make a sound. She couldn't let him know. Not yet. If he knew she was damaged, if he knew she was hurt, he might send her back. And she had nowhere to go. The cabin was sturdy, built of dark logs and chinked with mud and moss. Inside, a fire roared in a stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. It was clean, surprisingly so, but sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a rifle rack. "You sleep there," Silas said, pointing to the bed. "I'll take the pallet by the fire." Sarah blinked. "Mr. Coulter, we are to be married," the contract said. "Preacher comes in a week." He cut her off, his back to her as he stoked the fire. "We don't share a bed until the words are said. I'm a man of my word, Sarah. You're here." He turned then, and for the first time, she saw his eyes. They weren't cold. They were exhausted. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much winter and not enough spring. "Supper's beans and salt pork," he muttered, turning away again. "Eat. You look like a stiff wind would blow you over." Sarah ate, but the pain in her lower body was becoming a scream. It throbbed, a dull, hot ache that radiated down her leg. She shifted in the chair, wincing. Silas paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He didn't look up, but his body went still. The ride was rough. Yes, she lied. Just stiff from the coach. Silas didn't press her. But later, as she lay in the strange bed, listening to the wind and the rhythmic breathing of the stranger on the floor, Sarah cried silently. She touched the side of her leg beneath the quilt. It was hot to the touch. She was in trouble. And she was alone with a man who looked like he could snap a pine tree in half. 3 days passed. The snow did not stop. They were snowed in, an intimate imprisonment that should have been romantic but was filled with a thick, suffocating tension. Silas was not a cruel man, Sarah realized. He was efficient. He chopped wood. He checked his trap lines. He mended tools. He spoke only when necessary. But Sarah caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze was curious, almost puzzled, as if he were trying to solve a riddle. Sarah tried to be the good wife. She baked biscuits with the limited flour. She swept the floor. She mended a tear in his coat. But every movement was agony. The ache had turned into a burning fire. Walking required a supreme effort of will. On the evening of the 3rd day, she dropped a cast iron skillet. It clattered loudly against the stone hearth. Sarah gasped, clutching the table for support, her face draining of color. The room spun. Silas was at her side in a second. He didn't move like a big man. He moved like a predator, fast and silent. He caught her arm before she could fall. "Sarah?" His voice was sharp. "What is it? I'm clumsy," she gasped, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chill in the room. "I just slipped." "You didn't slip," Silas said, his grip firm but not painful. "You've been limping since you got off the stage. You hardly eat. You're burning up." He placed a rough, calloused hand against her forehead. "You have a fever." "I'm fine," she insisted, trying to pull away. Panic flared in her chest. If he sees it, he'll know. "Sarah, stop," he commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the authority in his voice froze her. "We are miles from a doctor. If you are sick, you tell me. Now." Sarah looked up at him. The firelight flickered in his dark eyes. There was concern there. Genuine, raw concern. The isolation of the mountains stripped away the pretenses of the city. There was no room for lies here. Her legs gave out. Silas scooped her up effortlessly, carrying her to the bed. He laid her down, his expression grim. "Where does it hurt?" he asked. Sarah turned her head away, shame burning her cheeks hotter than the fever. "I can't." "It's improper." "Improper?" Silas let out a short, harsh laugh. "Woman, propriety doesn't survive winter up here. Dying of pride is still dying. Tell me." Sarah closed her eyes, tears leaking out. "My hip, the right side, and down further." "I've been aching down there," she whispered, the confession hanging heavy in the air. It started before I left Boston. An accident. I fell." "I thought it would heal." It was a half-truth. She hadn't fallen. She had been pushed during a struggle with the banker's son when she refused his advances. She had struck her thigh against a rusty iron railing. She had bandaged it and run, too afraid to see a doctor who might ask questions. Silas didn't hesitate. "I need to look. Silas, please. Sarah." He sat on the edge of the bed, his voice dropping to a gentle rumble she hadn't heard before. "I am not going to hurt you. But if that's infection, it will your leg. Or your life. Let me help you." She nodded, a jerky, terrified motion. Silas moved the quilt aside. With surprisingly gentle fingers, he lifted the hem of her nightdress. When he saw the angry, swollen discoloration on her outer thigh, extending toward her hip, he hissed through his teeth. "Damn it," he whispered. "It's festered." He looked at her, his face serious. "This needs to be lanced and cleaned. Now. It's going to hurt like hell, Sarah. I'm sorry." Sarah gripped the sheets. "Do it." What followed was a blur of pain and steam. Silas worked with a focus that was terrifying. He boiled water. He sharpened his knife in the fire. He gave her a strip of leather to bite down on. "Look at me," he said, right before he began. He leaned over her, blocking out the rest of the room. "Focus on my eyes. Just look at me." When the knife touched her skin, she screamed. her teeth sinking into the leather. But she didn't look away. She stared into Silas's dark eyes, anchoring herself to him. He didn't flinch. He did what had to be done, his hands steady, his presence a fortress against the pain. When it was over, he cleaned the wound with whiskey and packed it with a poultice that smelled of pungent herbs. He bandaged her with clean linen. Sarah lay limp, exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead. Silas sat back, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked shaken, his chest heaving slightly. "You're tough," he said softly. "Boston didn't make you soft, Sarah Miller." He took a wet cloth and gently wiped the sweat from her face. It was the most intimate moment of her life. He wasn't her husband yet, but in that blood and pain, a bond had been forged that no preacher could replicate. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I thought," Sarah swallowed hard. "I thought you'd send me back. I have nothing left, Silas. If I go back, I'm ruined." Silas looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the blizzard. "I don't send wounded things out into the storm," he said quietly. "You rest. I'm not going anywhere." Recovery was slow. For the next week, Silas was her nurse. The barrier of awkwardness between them had been obliterated by the surgery. He helped her sit up, he brought her soup, he changed her bandages with a reverence that made Sarah's heart ache in a different way. She learned about him, too. She learned that the scar on his face came from a mountain lion he'd fought off with a knife 5 years ago. She learned he built the cabin himself. "Why a mail-order bride?" she asked him one night as the fire crackled. She was sitting up in bed, looking healthier, the color returning to her cheeks. Silas was whittling a piece of cedar by the hearth. He paused. "It gets quiet up here. A man can start talking to the trees if he's not careful." And he hesitated. "I wanted to build something that lasts. A legacy. Can't do that alone. Did you have anyone before?" Sarah asked softly. Silas's jaw tightened. "A long time ago. Before the war." She didn't wait. He didn't elaborate, and Sarah didn't push. They both had ghosts. But the piece of the cabin was about to be shattered. 2 weeks after her arrival, the snow cleared enough for travel. Sarah was walking now, with a slight limp, but the fever was gone. She was washing dishes when the sound of horses approaching made Silas freeze. He grabbed his rifle from the rack immediately. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice dropping to that command tone. "Away from the windows." Sarah peeked through a crack in the shutters. 3 men were riding up the path. They weren't the law. They looked like hired guns. Rough, dirty, and heavily armed. Leading them was a man on a white horse, wearing a fine suit that looked out of place in the wild. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the rifle cradled in his arm. "Morning, Cratchit," Silas called out. The man on the white horse smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This was Jebediah Cratchit. Sarah had heard the name in town during her brief stop. He owned half the valley and wanted the other half. Specifically, he wanted the water rights that ran through Silas's land. "Silas," Cratchit nodded. "See, you survived the storm, and I hear you have company. A new acquisition? My business is my own. Jebediah," Silas said calmly. "State yours or keep riding." "Always so hospitable," Cratchit sneered. "I'm here to make you the offer one last time. $500 for the deed. It's more than this pile of logs is worth." "The land isn't for sale," Silas said. "Not for 500. Not for 5,000. Cratchit's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward in his saddle. "You're a stubborn man, Coulter. But things are changing. Civilization is coming. Men like you're becoming obsolete. And now you have a woman to worry about. Accidents happen in these mountains. It was a threat, plain and simple." Silas cocked the rifle. The sound was loud in the crisp air. "Get off my land." Cratchit stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. He turned his horse. "Have it your way. But keep an eye on that pretty little bride of yours. I hear the law in Boston is looking for a woman fitting her description. Something about a missing diamond necklace?" Sarah's heart stopped. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Outside, Silas didn't flinch. "I don't care about Boston. I care about my land. Ride." Cratchit signaled his men, and they galloped away, kicking up slush and mud. Silas stood on the porch for a long time, watching them disappear. When he came back inside, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't warm anymore. He placed the rifle back on the rack and turned to Sarah. His face was unreadable. What did he mean, Sarah? Sarah backed up against the table. He's lying. He's just trying to scare you. Jebediah Cratchit is a snake, but he doesn't make up stories without a kernel of truth, Silas said, stepping closer. He knows you're from Boston. He knows about a necklace. Did you steal it? No, Sarah cried. I told you, I ran from a lie. The man who hurt me, his family, accused me to cover up what he did. I didn't take anything. Then why didn't you stay and fight it? Silas asked, his voice rising. Because I'm a seamstress's daughter and he's a banker's son, Sarah shouted back, tears stinging her eyes. Who would they believe, Silas? Who? The silence stretched between them. Silas looked at her, searching her face. He was a man who dealt in hard facts, in tracks and weather patterns. He didn't know how to navigate the treacherous waters of social deceit. If Cratchit knows, Silas said quietly, then he's going to use it. He'll bring the marshal down on us just to get me off this land. I'll leave, Sarah whispered. I won't let you lose your home because of me. She moved to go to the bedroom to pack her bag. Sarah. She stopped. Silas sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. I said I don't send wounded things into the storm. You're my wife. Or you will be when the preacher gets through the snow. You still want to marry me? Knowing I'm hunted? Silas walked over to her. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel his heat. I know a thing or two about being accused of things you didn't do, he said. And I know a thing or two about Cratchit. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. But you have to be completely honest with me. Is there anything else? Sarah hesitated. There was one more thing. The necklace. She hadn't stolen it. But in the struggle, she had grabbed her shawl and run. Later, she found the brooch. Not a necklace, but a diamond brooch, caught in the wool of her shawl. She still had it, hidden in the lining of her carpet bag. She had been too scared to sell it, too scared to send it back. She looked at Silas. If she told him she had the evidence on her, would he believe it was an accident? No, she lied. There is nothing else. Silas nodded, though his eyes lingered on hers a second too long. All right, then we prepare, because Cratchit isn't done, and winter isn't over. The days following Cratchit's visit were heavy with unvoiced fears. The cabin, once a shelter, now felt like a fortress under siege. Silas spent his daylight hours reinforcing the barn and checking the perimeter, his rifle never more than an arm's length away. Sarah, meanwhile, waged a war of her own, a war of guilt. The lie about the brooch sat in her chest, heavier than the cast-iron stove she cooked on. Every time Silas looked at her with that newfound softness, the guilt sharpened. On a Tuesday, under a sky the color of bruised slate, the preacher finally arrived. Reverend Thomas Caldwell was a thin, shivering man who rode a mule that looked as weary as he was. He had battled drifts 5 feet deep to reach Blackwood Ridge, driven by duty and the promise of a hot meal. Bad business in town, Reverend Caldwell muttered as he warmed his hands by the fire, his knuckles white and bony. Cratchit's buying up debts. Sheriff Halloway is turning a blind eye. They say he's looking for a woman, Silas, a fugitive. Sarah froze while pouring coffee. The dark liquid splashed over the rim of the tin cup, scalding her hand, but she didn't flinch. Silas took the cup from her, his fingers brushing hers. He looked at the Reverend. There are no fugitives here, Reverend. Just a bride and a groom. Are you ready to do your job? The ceremony was stark. There were no flowers, no organ music, no guests to weep with joy. Just the crackle of the fire, the howling wind, and the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. Sarah wore her best dress, the blue silk she had traveled in, now cleaned and pressed. Silas wore a black coat that was tight across his broad shoulders, his beard trimmed, his hair slicked back with water. He looked terrifyingly handsome. He looked like a man who could hold up the sky. Do you, Silas Edward Coulter, take this woman? I do, Silas said. His voice didn't waver. He looked straight at Sarah, his dark eyes locking onto hers, demanding her truth, demanding her soul. And do you, Sarah Ann Miller? Sarah's breath hitched. She was marrying a man while hiding a piece of evidence that could destroy him. She was bringing a storm into his house. But when she looked at the scar on his face and the rough hands that had tended to her wound with such gentleness, she knew she couldn't leave. She loved him. God help her. In 3 weeks of snow and pain, she had fallen in love with him. "I do," she whispered. Silas placed a ring on her finger. It wasn't gold. It was a band of polished ironwood, carved by his own knife, smooth and warm. "Until death," Silas said, not as a vow, but as a promise of protection. The Reverend left an hour later, anxious to beat the next snowfall. The cabin fell silent. The atmosphere shifted. They were married. The pallet on the floor was no longer necessary. Night fell early. Silas barred the door and turned to her. The tension was thick, electric. "Sarah," he said. "Silas." He walked to her, and for the first time, he touched her not as a nurse, but as a husband. His hands cupped her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. He kissed her. It was tentative at first, tasting of coffee and hesitation, but then he deepened it, and the hunger he had been suppressing surged forward. He lifted her, carrying her to the bed in the corner. But as he laid her down, as his hands began to undo the buttons of her dress, Sarah panicked. The brooch. It was in the carpet bag, but the bag was under the bed. What if he saw it? What if the lie came out now, in this moment of vulnerability? She stiffened. Silas pulled back immediately, his breathing heavy. "You're afraid." "No," she lied, her heart hammering. The wound. It still aches." It was an excuse. The wound was nearly healed. Silas studied her face in the dim light. The passion in his eyes cooled, replaced by that puzzled, analytical look. He sat up, adjusting his shirt. "I told you I wouldn't hurt you," he said, his voice flat. "We wait." He stood up and walked to the fire, turning his back to her. Sarah lay in the cold bed, the wedding night ruined by her own fear. She wanted to call him back. She wanted to tell him everything. But the shadow of the law and the fear of losing this sanctuary kept her mouth shut. 2 days after the wedding, thaw began. The snow melted into slush, revealing the brown, scarred earth of the mountain. With the thaw came the work. Silas was gone from dawn until dusk, repairing the fencing that the elk had trampled and checking the dam that controlled the water flow to the valley. The very water Cratchit wanted. Sarah decided it was time to make herself useful. She would clean the cabin from top to bottom. She would make this place a home, not just a shelter. She scrubbed the floors, she beat the rugs, and finally, she decided to organize the storage loft. While moving a stack of old pelts, she found a loose floorboard. Curious, she pried it up. Beneath it was a small wooden box. Sarah knew she shouldn't open it. A man's past is his own. But curiosity is a potent poison. She lifted the lid. Inside was a tintype photograph of a woman, beautiful, with laughing eyes and dark curls. And beneath the photo, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were signed Clara. "My dearest Silas, I cannot wait for the war to end. The baby kicked today." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. A baby? Silas had a child? He had mentioned a woman who didn't wait, but he hadn't mentioned a child. She read the last letter. It wasn't from Clara. It was from a doctor in Atlanta, Mr. Coulter. "It is my grievous duty to inform you that your wife and infant son perished from the fever." Sarah dropped the letter. He hadn't just lost a lover. He had lost a family. That was why he was so protective. That was why he built this cabin like a fortress. He was trying to protect the future because he had failed to protect the past. And she was lying to him. Guilt overwhelmed her. She couldn't keep the brooch anymore. It felt like a cursed object. She had to get rid of it. If she buried it in the woods, the secret would be gone. She scrambled down the ladder, grabbed her carpet bag, and fished out the diamond brooch. It glinted in the sunlight, cold and mocking. It was shaped like a serpent eating its own tail, a symbol of eternity, or perhaps a cycle of deceit. She threw on her shawl and opened the door. Silas was standing there. He had come back early for lunch. He was covered in mud, holding a broken shovel. His eyes went from her face to her hand. Sarah tried to hide it behind her back, but she was too slow. "What is that?" Silas asked. His voice was very quiet. "Nothing," Sarah whispered, backing away. "Show me. Silas, please." He dropped the shovel. It clanged against the porch. He walked into the house, backing her against the table. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. He didn't squeeze hard, but his grip was iron. He turned her hand over. The diamond serpent sparkled brilliantly in the rustic cabin. It was worth more than the land, the cabin, and everything Silas owned combined. Silas stared at it. Then he looked at her. The betrayal in his eyes was worse than anger. It was a breaking of the light. "You told me there was nothing else," he said. "I was scared," Sarah cried. "I found it in my shawl after I ran." "I didn't steal it, Silas. I swear." "You've been here 3 weeks," Silas said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You slept in my bed. You took my name. And you kept this damnation hidden in your bag? Do you know what Cratchit will do if he finds this? I was going to bury it. You should have told me," Silas roared, the sound shaking the rafters. "I would have defended you. I would have died for you, Sarah. But you didn't trust me. You treated me like a fool." He released her wrist as if her skin burned him. He grabbed the brooch from her hand. "Silas, what are you doing?" "I'm ending this," he growled. He marched to the door. But before he could step out, a gunshot shattered the air. Wood splintered from the doorframe inches from Silas's head. He threw himself backward, tackling Sarah to the floor as a second shot blew out the oil lamp on the table. "Stay down!" Silas hissed, the anger instantly replaced by combat instinct. "Who is it?" Sarah screamed. "Cratchit!" Silas spat, crawling toward his rifle. "He didn't come to buy the land this time. He came to take it." The cabin was under heavy fire. Bullets thudded against the thick logs, punching through the chinking and sending puffs of dust into the air. Silas reached the window, risking a glance. 5 men. Maybe 6. "They're in the tree line." He turned to Sarah. She was huddled under the table, shaking. He looked at her, and for a moment, the anger returned. But then he saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror of the woman who had arrived in the snow. He crawled over to her and shoved the brooch into her hand. "Put it away," he ordered. "If we live through this, we settle it. But right now, you need to shoot." "I can't shoot!" "You better learn," Silas said grimly. He pulled a heavy Colt revolver from his belt and pressed it into her trembling hands. "Point. Pull. Don't close your eyes." He moved back to the window, raised his rifle, and fired. A man screamed in the distance. "That's one," Silas muttered. The siege lasted for hours. The sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. Cratchit's men were pinned down, but they had the numbers. They were moving closer, using the stumps and rocks for cover. "They're going to burn us out," Silas said, reloading. His face was smeared with soot and sweat. "As soon as it's dark, they'll rush the porch with torches." "What do we do?" Sarah asked. She was gripping the pistol so hard her knuckles were blue. Silas looked at the trapdoor in the floor. The root cellar. "You go down there. Hide." "No," Sarah said. Silas paused. "What?" "I'm not hiding in a hole while you die for a lie, I told," Sarah said. Her voice was shaking, but her chin was high. She crawled out from under the table. "I caused this. Cratchit is here because he knows I'm weak. He thinks he can use me to get to you. Sarah, get back." "No!" She scrambled to the back of the cabin, where the small kitchen window faced the steep slope of the mountain. "There's a back way, isn't there? Up the ridge? It's too steep. And you're limping. I can make it," she said. "If I run, they'll see me. They'll chase me. It will draw them away from the cabin." "Absolutely not," Silas barked. "I am not using my wife as bait. I'm not your wife right now," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm just a liar who brought trouble to your door. Let me fix it, Silas." Before he could stop her, she unlatched the back shutter. "Sarah!" She didn't listen. She pushed the shutter open and scrambled out into the twilight. "Hey!" She screamed at the top of her lungs. "Cratchit!" "You want the diamond? I have it." The firing stopped instantly. "Sarah, no!" Silas roared, abandoning his post to run to the back door. Outside, in the cold mud, Sarah held the brooch high. It caught the last rays of the sun. "It's here! Come and get it!" She turned and ran. not toward the safety of the woods, but up the treacherous, rocky incline of the ridge, away from the cabin, away from Silas. "Get her!" Cratchit's voice echoed from the trees. "Forget the house! Get the girl!" Silas watched through the crack in the door as the shadows of men detached themselves from the tree line and sprinted after her. They were ignoring him. They wanted the prize. Silas didn't think. He didn't plan. A primal roar tore from his throat. He kicked the back door open and charged out. He wasn't running to escape. He was hunting. He raised his rifle and fired while running. One of the pursuers dropped. Silas jacked the lever, ejected the shell, and fired again. Missed. He dropped the rifle and drew his hunting knife. He ran up the slope, his long legs eating up the ground. Sarah was slow. Her hip was failing her. He could see her stumbling 50 yards up, near the edge of the ravine. Cratchit was on a horse, forcing the beast up the rocky trail, cutting off her path. "Nowhere to go, darlin'!" Cratchit yelled, drawing his pistol. Sarah reached the edge of the ravine. It was a 100-foot drop into the icy creek below. She turned, her back to the void. Cratchit leveled his gun at her. "Give it here," Cratchit smiled. "And maybe I'll let you live." "You never let anyone live," Sarah said. Her fear was gone. In its place was a cold. She looked past Cratchit and saw Silas coming up the ridge, a dark, avenging angel. She needed to buy him time. She held the brooch over the edge of the cliff. "Come one step closer and I drop it." Cratchit froze. "You wouldn't!" "Try me." While Cratchit hesitated, Silas closed the distance. He hit the nearest henchman from behind, driving his knife into the man's shoulder and throwing him to the ground. The man screamed. Cratchit spun his horse around. He saw Silas. He raised his gun to fire at the mountain man. "Silas!" Sarah screamed. She did the only thing she could. She threw the brooch, not at Cratchit, but at the face of his horse. The diamond struck the horse's eye. The beast reared up, screaming in pain and panic. Cratchit, taken by surprise, lost his seat. He tumbled backward, his gun firing harmlessly into the sky. He hit the ground hard, rolling toward the edge where Sarah stood. He scrambled to grab her ankle, his face twisted in a mask of hate. "You bitch!" Sarah kicked him. It was a clumsy kick, fueled by weeks of pain and years of repression. Her boot connected with his nose. Cratchit flailed, his hand slipping from the mud. He went over. There was no long scream, just the sound of a body hitting the rocks and then the splash of water far below. Silence returned to the mountain. The remaining hirelings, seeing their boss fall and the demon-like figure of Silas Coulter standing over a groaning man with a bloody knife, decided the paycheck wasn't worth it. They scattered into the woods. Sarah stood by the edge, shivering violently. Her adrenaline crashed. Her knees buckled. She didn't hit the ground. Silas was there. He caught her, pulling her into his chest. He was covered in mud and blood, his heart hammering against her ear like a war drum. "You foolish woman," he rasped, burying his face in her hair. "You foolish, brave woman," Sarah sobbed, clutching his coat. "Is he gone? He's gone," Silas said. "It's over." "The brooch," Sarah whispered. "It fell with him." "Good," Silas said. "Let the river have it. I don't need it." He lifted her up, carrying her down the mountain, back to the cabin that was scarred but still standing. The silence that followed the gunshot was heavier than the snow that still blanketed the ridge. For 3 days after the siege, neither Sarah nor Silas spoke much of what had happened on the edge of the ravine. They moved through the cabin like ghosts haunting their own lives, the adrenaline of survival slowly replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The cabin bore the scars of the battle. Sunlight streamed through bullet holes in the chinking, beams of dust dancing in the cold air. The front door, splintered by Cratchit's first shot, had to be braced with a heavy oak table every night. But the fear that had once permeated the logs, the fear of discovery, the fear of the past, was gone. It had fallen into the icy gorge along with Jebediah Cratchit. Recovery was a slow, quiet season. Sarah's hip, aggravated by the desperate scramble up the ridge, ached with a ferocity that sometimes took her breath away. But she no longer hid it. There was no shame left between them. When she limped, Silas was there, his hand steady under her elbow, offering support without pity. He treated her injury not as a defect, but as a battle scar, proof that she had fought for this life. March arrived with a roar. The warm Chinook winds swept down from the peaks, turning the drifts into rushing rivulets of water. The sound of the river below the ridge grew to a thunderous crash, a constant reminder of the watery grave that held the diamond and the man who had coveted it. With the thaw came the labor. To keep the demons at bay, they worked. Silas felled new timber to repair the barn and the porch. Sarah, unable to navigate the muddy fields easily, took to the garden plot near the house. She turned the earth, dark and rich with the smell of pine needles and loam, planting the seeds Silas had traded for in the autumn. It was a Tuesday in late May when the final shadow fell over Blackwood Ridge. Sarah was washing linens in a tub on the porch, her sleeves rolled up, the sun warming her neck. Silas was in the corral, shoeing one of the black horses. The air was filled with the scent of wild sage and wet earth. Then the dogs barked. It was a frantic baying of an attack, but the low, warning growl that signaled a stranger. Silas dropped the horse's hoof and grabbed his hammer. Sarah wiped her soapy hands on her apron, her heart giving a single, painful thump against her ribs. A lone rider emerged from the tree line. He didn't ride like a hired gun. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing a long duster coat and a hat with a silver band. A tin star glinted on his chest, catching the noon sun. "Go inside, Sarah," Silas said, his voice low as he stepped onto the porch. "No," Sarah said, moving to stand beside him. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his calloused ones. "We did this together. We face it together." The rider pulled up to the porch. He was an older man, his face a map of wrinkles and sunspots, with eyes that were a piercing, judgmental blue. He looked like a man who had seen every sin the West had to offer and had forgiven none of them. "Silas Coulter," the man said. His voice was like dry leaves scraping over stone. "Marshall," Silas acknowledged, not letting go of Sarah's hand. "I'm Marshall Jeremiah Thorne, out of Denver," the lawman said, swinging a leg over his saddle and landing heavily in the mud. He adjusted his gun belt. "I'm looking for a man named Jebediah Cratchit. His family back east hasn't heard from him in months. Rumor in town is he rode up this way." The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to meet the marshal's gaze. "Cratchit was here," Silas said evenly. "Back in the winter." "Was he?" Thorne stepped onto the porch, his spurs jingling softly. He looked at the patched bullet holes in the wall. He looked at the new wood on the doorframe. "Looks like you folks had some trouble." "Wolf pack," Silas lied smoothly. "Had a hard winter. They got bold." The marshal hummed, a non-committal sound. He turned his gaze to Sarah. He studied her for a long, uncomfortable minute. Her silk dress that had been mended a dozen times, her rough hands, the way she leaned slightly to the left to spare her hip. "And you must be the wife," Thorne said. "Sarah, is it?" "We have a wire from Boston, ma'am. Seems a woman fitting your description left in a hurry. Something about a missing heirloom, a diamond brooch. Very valuable." Sarah's throat closed up. This was it. The moment she had run 2,000 miles to avoid. She started, her voice trembling. Silas stepped forward, shielding her with his body. "My wife is from Ohio, Marshall, and she has no jewelry. You can search the cabin if you like. You'll find flour, beans, and a Bible. No diamonds." Marshall Thorne stared at Silas. The two men locked eyes, the immovable object against the unstoppable force. Thorne was a hunter of men, but he was also a judge of character. He looked at the scars on Silas's face. He looked at the protective way Silas stood in front of the woman, and he looked at the river raging in the distance. "Cratchit was a bad man," Thorne said softly, almost to himself. "A man who bought the law when he couldn't break it. If he came up here looking for trouble." Thorne walked to the edge of the porch and looked down toward the ravine. "Well, the mountains have a way of dealing with trouble." He turned back to them. "I checked the creek bed downriver on my way up. Found a horse carcass. Saddlebags were empty. But I found this stuck in the mud nearby." Thorne reached into his pocket and pulled out a pistol. It was Cratchit's engraved revolver, rusted and bent, useless. "Found a hat, too," Thorne continued. "No body. But the water is fast this year. If a man fell in, he's halfway to the Pacific by now." He looked at Sarah again. "And as for Boston, well, Descriptions are tricky things. Wires get crossed. The woman they're looking for was a thief. You look like a homesteader to me, Mrs. Coulter. Sarah let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 6 months. Tears pricked her eyes. I am Marshall. I am a homesteader. Thorne nodded. He holstered Cratchit's rusted gun. I'll report that Cratchit likely perished in an accident due to the storm. And I'll tell Boston they're south. You folks stay safe. You need water for your horse? Silas offered, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. No, Thorne said, mounting up. I've lingered here too long. Best to let the past stay buried. They watched him ride away until he was nothing but a speck against the green of the pines. When he was gone, Sarah turned into Silas's chest and sobbed. It wasn't a cry of sadness, but of release. The shackles of her past had finally been struck off. Silas held her until the sun dipped below the peaks, casting the valley in purple twilight. Come inside, he whispered. I have something for you. The cabin was warm, the fire popping cheerfully in the hearth. Silas went to the mantel and retrieved a small box wrapped in brown paper. He had been working on it late at night, claiming he was fixing harnesses, but Sarah had heard the distinct scrape of a file against metal. I couldn't get you a ring, Silas said, looking suddenly shy, like a boy presenting a valentine. And I know you're used to fine things, things that sparkle. I don't want things that sparkle, Silas, Sarah said, wiping her eyes. Those things are cold. Open it. Sarah unwrapped the paper. Inside lay a hair comb. It wasn't made of gold or encrusted with gems. It was beaten silver, likely melted down from the few coins Silas had saved over the years. He had shaped it with his own hands. The top of the comb was etched with incredible delicacy, depicting the silhouette of the Blackwood Ridge tree line, and in the center, a single, small, blooming rose. It's not a diamond, Silas murmured, but it won't ever be lost. I made the teeth deep, so it'll hold. Like us, Sarah ran her thumb over the silver ridges. It was rough in places, imperfect, just like the man who made it. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It's perfect, she whispered. Silas stepped closer, taking the comb from her hand. Turn around. She turned, and he gently gathered her hair, sweeping it up from her neck. He slid the comb into place. His hands lingered on her shoulders, warm and heavy. I never thought I'd want this again, Silas admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I thought my life was just wood and snow until I died. I was ready to be alone, Sarah. And now? She asked, leaning back against him. Now, Silas said, kissing the top of her head. I'm terrified every time you walk out the door. But I've never been happier. Sarah turned in his arms. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, no longer shadowed by ghosts, but bright with a future they would build acre by acre. I love you, Silas Coulter, she said. I love you, Sarah, he replied. Now, let's eat. I believe I smell biscuits burning. Sarah laughed, a true, deep sound that filled the rafters. Years later, the people of the valley would tell stories about the Coulter place. They would talk about the woman with the slight limp who grew the best roses in the territory, and the giant of a man who looked at her as if she were the sun itself. They said that sometimes, if you looked into the deep pools of the river below the ridge, you might see a flash of light, a cursed diamond washing away in the silt. But up in the cabin, there were no curses. There was only the warmth of the fire, the silver comb on the nightstand, and the quiet, enduring peace of two souls who had weathered the storm and found their way home. And that, my friends, is the end of Sarah and Silas's journey. From a terrified bride on a stagecoach to a woman who stared down a killer on a cliff's edge, Sarah proved that true strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about how you heal after you're broken. It's said that Marshall Thorne knew exactly who Sarah was that day, but he also knew that the woman who stole the brooch no longer existed. She had died in the snow, and a new woman had risen in her place. I hope this story touched your heart. If you believe in second chances and the healing power of love, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications. I have a new tale coming next week about a gold prospector and a mystery that has been buried for 100 years. You won't want to miss it. Until next time, keep your fire lit and your powder dry.